So let me get a little bit of information from you all. You all are in STEM fields, yes? All in engineering or not necessarily? Engineering? Yeah. All graduate students, yes? How many of you would identify as Asian American? Any of you? You one, yes, two, Asian American. How many of you identify as international students? Several of you. Okay. That gives me a good sense of who I'm talking to, how much you'll be able to relate, and as insiders or outsiders to what I'm going to be talking about. Are you okay if I take off my mask? We are distant, so it will be easier for me if I get to take it off. Thank you. So I hope that we'll talk about things like COVID-19 hate, that we'll talk about discrimination based on accents, based on names. Maybe we'll talk about the China Initiative, if any of you have heard of that. Let me ask you, what do you hope to talk about? What do you hope that I will talk about during this? Anybody?
I can go.
Yeah.
I think for me, like in thinking about being an ally, I think especially in the US, things are framed in a very black and white kind of race
Yes.
dichotomy. And so in talking about being an ally outside of that dichotomy, and how like specifically Asian is different than maybe like the African American.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
So in terms of Asian American, I saw a paradox there. So we, like Asian American, definitely minority people, but actually in STEM and engineering field, we have a really large population there.
Yes.
So sometimes, I don't know, it feels like every time people about talking about minority, but Asia is not in that group.
Very true. When in STEM fields and engineering, people talk about minorities, they probably mean African American, Latinx, maybe Native American. They don't typically keep Asian Americans in that group. Asian Americans are what some people would describe as overrepresented. If Asian Americans are 5% of the US population and we have 40% of the College of Engineering being Asian American, that's overrepresented. But I guess the challenge to that is, what's the correct percentage of representation? Under, over, what's the right number? Tell me, what is the right number? I don't know that there is a right number. So yes, do Asian Americans get treated differently and negatively because of race? Yeah, of course. So I think, yeah, we'll talk about all those kinds of things, I hope. Let me pose this kind of question to you. You're all in STEM fields. It's science, it's data, it's numbers, it's facts, right? There can be no discrimination when we're dealing with facts and science, right? Talking to a room full of almost all women. Do you ever experience discrimination based on gender? I bet you do. I bet we could talk about that at length. And I hope we will talk about that some. Let me move on. I want to talk about a few of these kinds of questions. Who belongs in this country? And why do we think so? Asians in the US, Asians have been in the US for 150 years. What do we know about the history of anti-Asian discrimination and racism? And in the most recent past, how does the hate that we see in the news or in social media during COVID-19 fit with those experiences historically? And you'll see, at least it's my goal, to show you it fits very well. And I also hope we'll get to talk a lot about allyship. How do you be good allies to one another, depending on whoever, regardless of who you are. Let me start by talking about a current study, fairly recent, and just a few months ago, a current study about Asian Americans' feelings about belonging belonging in the United States. Many Asian American young people are struggling these days to feel fully accepted as American because they're growing up in a time of alarming rates of harassment, bullying, anti-Asian rhetoric, hate crimes, and discrimination. According to this recent study, only 29% of Asian Americans completely agree that they feel like that they belong and are accepted in the United States. 33% of Black Americans completely agree. So Asian Americans are even less comfortable than Black Americans. Young Asian Americans, those were defined as between ages of 18 and 24, only 19% agreed that they feel like they belong and are completely accepted in the US. As opposed to those over 65, 51% feel they completely belong. So something is happening to young people right now that is making Asian Americans and Black Americans, as two groups, feel that this is not a welcoming place. Overall, Asian Americans are the least likely to feel accepted compared with Black American, Latino, and white Americans. Experts say this mix of feelings of feeling marginalized, being seen as perpetual foreigners, and this alarming rise in anti-Asian hate and violence, and how quickly information is disseminated through social media contributes to this Gen Z attitudes of feeling unaccepted. So about a year ago, less than a year ago, February, this other study was conducted, and I want to share with you some of the interesting results. Let's talk about this national online study about attitudes and perceptions of Asian Americans by a general population of Americans, all a wide spectrum of US residents. It was conducted by this nonprofit organization called Launch, and results were released this past summer. The survey asked Americans, name a well-known Asian American. So take a moment for yourself, see if you can think of any well-known Asian Americans. Don't say anything out loud yet. Now think about the average American, whoever in your mind is the average American. Who do you think the average American thinks of? Okay, now let me ask the audience, what do you think the average American's answers were to the question, name a well-known Asian American? What do you think? Call them out.
Michelle Kwan.
Michelle Kwan, the skater. Sandra Oh, the actress. Bruce Lee, martial artist. Good, good. All good answers. Any other answers? Who? Oh, okay. Do you think the average American knows that? A machine learning guy? Maybe. We'll see. Here's the answers. The number one answer, I don't know. I can't name one. 58% of Americans cannot name a famous Asian American. Let that sink in. 7%, the next highest number is Jackie Chan. Remember, Jackie Chan is from Hong Kong. He's not American. 5% said Bruce Lee. Bruce Lee's been dead for 50 years. The next highest is Lucy Liu. Only 3% said Kamala Harris, the sitting vice president of the United States, who was just inaugurated a few months ago to great fanfare. Only 3% could think of her name. The takeaways from this: Americans struggle to name prominent Asian Americans, despite Asian Americans really being in the news and media. Nearly 80% of Asian Americans say they don't feel respected and are discriminated against, leading to this feeling of invisibility, of feeling unheard and unseen, and perpetually foreigners in this country, even though there are more and more Asians and Asian Americans in pop culture. Okay, let's move on. Can you name some of these people? Not all of these that I'm about to show you are Asian American, but they're all well known in US pop culture. I'm going to show you 10, and you keep track in your own head how many of them you can identify. Remember, 58% of Americans can't name a single famous Asian American. I'm going to show you a bunch. Let's do this quickly. Who's this? Anyone? If you know, call it out. Olivia Rodrigo, a singer-songwriter, she's an actress known from Disney Channel, High School Musical, and in the past year, chart-topping debut album, Sour. She has a Filipino-American father, white American mother. Nathan, oh, you're on a roll. Nathan Chen, 2022 Olympic gold medalist in figure skating. He's a 22-year-old Chinese American. Anyone? Maitreyi Ramakrishnan, Indian American actress, star of Netflix comedy Never Have I Ever, where she plays Devi Vishwakumar. Excellent show. Excellent show. K-pop, BTS, South Korean boy band leading the Korean wave, most successful K-pop band ever. Suni Lee, 18-year-old Hmong American gymnast, gold medalist in the 2020 Tokyo Olympics. Simu Liu, Chinese-Canadian, I cheated there, Chinese-Canadian actor, star of Marvel's Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, and he played Zheng in the award-winning TV show Kim's Convenience. Good, Hasan Minhaj. Indian-American comedian, actor, political commentator, best known for his award-winning Netflix show, Patriot Act. There we go. Sandra Oh. Again, I cheated. She's a Korean-Canadian actress, best known for her roles in TV shows like Grey's Anatomy and Killing Eve, among others. Jeremy Lin, a Taiwanese-American professional basketball player, played for the New York Knicks. Back in 2011-12, 10 years ago, he generated that cultural phenomenon known as Linsanity. And finally, you got this one. Current Kamala Harris, the current Vice President of the United States, the first Asian American, the first African American, the first female Vice President of the United States, the highest ranking Asian American, highest ranking female official in US history. Did you know she used to live in Champaign, Illinois when she was young? For about a year, when she was, I forget how old, like 5 or 6 years old, her father was a young assistant professor on the economics faculty, and her mother was a researcher, a science researcher. This was after the parents finished their PhDs. They came here as a first job. She and her sister lived in Champaign in 2 different houses for about a year, and then they moved on to University of Wisconsin-Madison. So she lived in Champaign. How many of these 10 did you identify? Did any of you know all 10? Any of you? No. These are just a few people of Asian descent in popular culture today. Remember, 58% of Americans couldn't name a single well-known Asian American. Think about how many you knew or didn't know and how this might fit with the results that we just mentioned. Why are so many Asians in the US unseen or unknown? Why are Asians so hated these days by some? Think about these kinds of questions as we discuss the more serious issues that we're about to talk about. Oh boy. Okay, let's jump in. 150 years of anti-Asian racism and scapegoating. This is the historical downer part of the discussion, but it helps set the stage for what's about to come later. I'm going to show you this overview of what we've experienced this past couple of years with COVID. Is definitely not new. I'm going to show you there's 150 years of systemic racism against Asians in the US. For example, here are some highlights. In 1875, the very first restrictive federal immigration law in the US effectively prohibited the entry of Chinese women to the US, referring to Chinese women as undesirable and immoral. A few years later, 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act prevented all Chinese laborers, including the men, from immigrating to the US. It was the very first US immigration law that excluded an entire ethnic group. Essentially, kind of mostly before 1882, if you had a way to get to the US, you're in, that's fine. There were no serious immigration laws until we decided to start limiting Chinese from coming. Let's fast forward to 1942, World War II. The US finally entered the war against Japan, Germany, and Italy. In the name of US national security, the US government forced the relocation and incarceration of 120,000 Japanese Americans, but not Italian and German Americans, and imprisoned Japanese Americans for 3 years until the war ended. More recently, not that long ago, 1982, Vincent Chin in Detroit, Michigan, a Chinese-American Vincent Chin was viciously beaten to death with a baseball bat by two white men. The perpetrators were both auto workers, angered by the decline of the US auto industry that were at that point threatened by the new fuel-efficient Japanese import cars. Toyota, Honda, Nissan were all new to the US, and the Detroit automakers were not doing well. What was the result of the trial of the two men who beat him to death? Well, 3 years probation, no jail time, and a $3,000 fine. Post 9/11, 20 years ago or so, Al-Qaeda terrorist attack on the US on September 11th were the deadliest in human history in the US. In the immediate aftermath, hate crimes dramatically increased against people who were perceived to be of Middle Eastern descent, of Muslim, Sikh, and South Asian descent. Within the first week, there were almost 650 documented incidents in the media. Those were just the documented incidents of hate crimes against these groups of people. Certainly, many, many times more were not reported. And now in this past couple of years, COVID-19 violence and scapegoating doesn't sound all that unusual when I lay out the history like this for you. Asians have not been necessarily welcomed in the US. Let me go on to this one. Early on in the pandemic, you see May, so a couple months into the declaration of this global pandemic, the United Nations made a statement, a very important statement that said, these recent attacks on Asian Americans or on Asians around the world are unacceptable. The Secretary General said, this pandemic continues to unleash a tsunami of hate and xenophobia, scapegoating and scaremongering. And he urged governments around the world to act now to strengthen the immunity of our societies against the virus of hate. Well, unfortunately, that's not what happened in this country or in other countries. Arguably, our US government leaders at the time inflamed the hatred and racism against Chinese and Asians more broadly. Early in that outbreak, in Wuhan, China, with a still at that time unnamed illness in December of 2019, there was widespread fear-mongering, misinformation, conspiracy theories about what this new virus was and where it came from. People speculated maybe it was created by the Chinese government in a lab to be unleashed on the world. Maybe it came from Chinese people who like to eat those weird foods like bats and dogs. Chinese people brought this disease here, so they should go back to their country. There were so many reports of people from all ages, including elementary school kids who were being bullied by classmates and taunted with racial slurs. In that first year and a half, 2 years of the pandemic, there were over 10,000 reported incidents of anti-Asian hate in the US. And so most cases were never reported. These were just the reported incidents. 81% of Asian American adults say violence is rising against Asian Americans. We all saw the newscasts or the social media postings of elderly Asian Americans, oftentimes women, being physically assaulted, hit, beaten, kicked, sometimes while others stand by and watched it happen. Verbal harassment remains the most commonly reported form of hate. Most incidents occur on public streets or in public businesses, and women report 2/3 of the cases. I'm not sure that women receive more hate, but they certainly report hate more often than men. Here are some representative cases of the 10,000. I'll just stop for a moment and let you read them. So I wonder, do any of these cases up here surprise you? Is there a way for me to move that? Is this the more?
Yeah.
I can hide this one?
Floating meeting.
Hide floating meeting.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do any of these surprise you? No? Not surprised. Unfortunately, it shouldn't surprise you. The public, there we go. The public health guidance has pretty much been consistent for the entire time. Wear a mask, stay distant, get your vaccine, wash your hands. Nothing surprising, but early on in the pandemic, Asians around the world seem to adopt face mask wearing way before anybody else, including in the US. Why was that? Because in Asia, in many countries in Asia for 20 years, people have been wearing masks when it's flu season, when they themselves are sick, and when there's air pollution. In a lot of big cities, there's a lot of air pollution a lot of the time. So Asians in the US who are international students or new immigrants were fairly accustomed to wearing masks. Okay, there's a new virus, we'll wear masks. That also made Asians in the US targets, easy targets for hateful people who wanted to blame someone. And so many Asians in the US in those first few months wearing masks were actually victims of a lot of hate because of this early adoption. Many people have been emboldened by racist rhetoric from, it was the highest leaders of the land in our country who use racist terms like China virus and Kung flu to refer to the coronavirus. Many people believe that Donald Trump and his people fueled the anti-Asian prejudice and bias. Why shouldn't we call it the China virus? Well, the World Health Organization says so. In 2015, the World Health Organization established new naming practices for human infectious diseases. Among the highlights were we should minimize negative impacts on nations, economies, and people by using more specific descriptive terms about the symptoms, about the manifestation of the disease, and of the pathogens. So today, when viruses are discovered and named, they don't use those kinds of terms. They don't use occupational references, species of animals, food, people's names, geographic locations, cultures, populations, or industries. So some examples of old diseases that have unfortunate names that if they were discovered now, they wouldn't get these names. They would include monkeypox, something in the news these days, the Spanish flu from 1918, Ebola. Ebola is a river in Congo. Zika virus. Zika is a forest in Uganda. West Nile virus, MERS. MERS was the Middle East respiratory syndrome. Swine flu, monkeypox, Legionnaire's disease. Legionnaire's disease was discovered in an American Legion convention in 1976. So why COVID-19? You can see for yourself. That is how it was named. So mental health experts have found that victims and survivors of hate are more stressed by the anti-Asian racism than by the pandemic itself. The American Medical Association has declared racism a public health crisis back in November of 2020, fairly recently. Some of the common health and mental health effects that can result from incidents of discrimination and racism and microaggressions include heightened fear, stress, anxiety, uncertainty, depression, PTSD. And there is a secondary trauma in the emotional experience of that result when someone hears about or reads or witnesses somebody else's trauma. In the media, if we watch these clips over and over again of people being beaten, you yourself could have a secondary trauma from watching, observing that so much. People may have many of the same symptoms as people who firsthand underwent the traumatic event. And people are experiencing intergenerational trauma, especially in immigrant and refugee populations. Maybe their family left someplace else in the world because of war, religious persecution, hardship, famine, and today's stressors may be exacerbating those former stressors. What are some common microaggressions that Asian Americans or Asians in the US or any kind of minority group experience? These kinds of things, they can happen while walking down the street, hanging out with friends, on social media. ethnic slurs, those slanty-eyed gestures, comments on how good your English is, making fun of our names, making fun of what people might say are smelly, weird foods, being taunted about COVID-19 by calling it names or pretending to cough. How are we doing? Being famous doesn't inoculate people from hate. Here's an example. Jeremy Lin, the famous basketball player, back in February 2021, shared on his social media that he had been taunted on the NBA court being called coronavirus, and that he said he's been experiencing anti-Asian slurs since high school, college, and in the pros. After seeking mental health help, he says he's learned to take some of that negative emotion, process it better. And that when you go through trauma like this, it means there are wounds there that need to be addressed. How about Chloe Kim? She's the Korean American 2018 Winter Olympics medalist. Remember, she's Korean American. She received hundreds of racist messages every week in her social media around that time. She said, quote, "There were messages telling me to go back to China and to stop taking medals away from the white American girls on the team," unquote. She says she's been spit on in public, and now she always leaves her home prepared to defend herself in case of attack. She says, quote, "I think it got worse when COVID started. I was trying to get in the elevator at my apartment one day, and a woman started yelling at me, telling me, 'No, you can't get in here.' Sometimes I feel like everyone hates me because I'm Asian." Here's some grim statistics. In 2022, more Americans are likely to say that Asian Americans are partially responsible for COVID than in 2021. Things are getting worse. Public attitudes against Asians, the US, are getting worse. Now, 72% of Americans believe that racism against Asian Americans should be addressed. That's the good news. That's the good news. Let me stop for a moment. How is this hitting you? Any surprises, any reactions so far? Anything you want to talk about? Want to take a break? Take a drink? Good? Okay. I've dumped a lot of negativity on you. Let's try to pull this into some more positivity. So what can you do? What can any of us do? How can we be allies? No matter what the situation, what the issue, social issue may be. Can white people be advocates for Black Lives Matter? Yeah, of course. Can men be feminists? Yeah, of course. Can straight people be allies to LGBT community? Yes, of course. Can anyone help stop Asian hate? Yes, yes, yes. What we often hear is public leaders, the president, the governor, leaders give out public statements saying these acts of violence are unacceptable. And that's good. We need leaders to make these symbolic messages of solidarity and goodwill. But that's not enough. We need solutions. How do we change society beyond these simple messages? Here are some ideas. We need to do things like teaching ethnic studies in schools. How much these days are taught in public schools in the US? For those of you who were raised in the United States, how much did you learn about Asian American history, for example? Nothing or almost nothing would be my guess. And that's the case for most ethnic racial issues. The state of Illinois became the very first in the country to now mandate in kindergarten through 12th grade public schools must now teach a unit of Asian American community history in the curriculum. The very first state, and it was only this past summer, a year ago, that it was established, and it's now mandated beginning this fall, this semester, at all public schools in Illinois. Yay for Illinois. At this point, there are now 4 states that have followed suit and had a similar kind of mandate of teaching of Asian American history, all because of COVID hate. Here's some more good news. Oh, let me go on. California recently became the first state in the nation to mandate 1 semester of ethnic studies in high school. So not just Asian American history, but all kinds of ethnic studies for a whole semester in the state of California. Stories and experiences of Americans of various racial and ethnic communities allow students to better understand other people, experiences and histories, and ultimately improve cross-cultural education and advance racial equity. That's the idea. Here's more good news. The US Congress passed the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. President Biden signed it into law in May of 2021. It offers more resources to address hate crimes at the local, state, and federal levels. It will help speed up investigations of hate crimes and will expand public reporting efforts. That's great. Some critics say that it doesn't go far enough because it doesn't address the root causes of hate. We hope that teaching of ethnic studies in school as kids grow up will help address that, but certainly it won't address everything. What can any of us do as allies to help address injustice? Here are a few ideas. You can learn and educate yourself about the histories of racism against various groups or other injustices against other groups. Understanding the challenges that these communities face in the past are important in connecting the dots to how things are impacted today. You can support and listen. One of the easiest things you can do is to let family and friends know that you can provide a safe space for them to talk about their feelings, their problems, concerns. You can listen and support and believe people. You can participate and donate. Consider donating time or money to an organization you believe in. You can support small businesses. You know, Asian American restaurants, Chinese restaurants in particular, were especially hard hit during the pandemic because so many people didn't want to go to Chinese owned establishments. You can become civically engaged, attend rallies or demonstrations to let your voice be heard. Next week, if you're legally able, vote in the election. You can even post issues to your own social media or stare with stickers on your laptop. Those are ways of having your voice heard. And you can speak up, hold each other accountable when you hear something inappropriate. If you hear a microaggression against someone, speak up, share what you've learned, and report hate crimes to national and to local authorities. Even here at U of I, we have an office that deals with issues of bias and hate. You can let people know so that the university will do something about it. Let me take a moment and ask you, can you think of other ways to take action to be allies? What are ways that you do or your friends help each other? Yes, thank you.
One thing to think about is just their inner circle and what whatever it looks like there as far as like the brown would be and like branching out more than just keep it out of like
Reach out to different people. Terrific. What else? What else? Let me move on then. Here are other simple ways of being allies. Learn, support, participate, and speak up. How do you talk to people when they want to share with you something has happened? Maybe it's anti-Asian racism, or maybe it's some other kind of social injustice. Here are things that you can do to be a supportive friend and ally. You can label behaviors as racist and wrong. Sometimes it's hard to use those words, but if you use it, it's powerful. You can help label people's feelings and validate their experiences. You can give context and history. You've just learned something about anti-Asian history in the US. Giving context helps to normalize what you experience happens to lots of people. You can ask immigrants and international students about their experiences in their home countries and how that differs from what they experience here in the US, and acknowledge this is hard to talk about. It's not fun. No one likes talking about these things, but it is important to talk about. sometimes people ask me, where are good resources to get more information about this? And here's some that I like to suggest. The first one is our own Asian American Cultural Center website. I've been working there since we opened 18 years ago. And we provide a wide variety of programs and workshops. All of them are free and open to the public. To find out when we have them, join our social media, follow us on social media or our website. We also have a newsletter that goes out every 2 weeks, and you can sign up on the website. The next one down, Asian Americans Advancing Justice Chicago, I think is the premier civil rights social justice organization in the Midwest. Check out their social media or their website to see the latest things that they work on. Stop AAPI Hate is a national organization based in California, but is a national organization that collects data on hate crimes and pushes for legislation. The next three, NBC News, Next Shark, and Angry Asian Man, are news sites or blog sites that are updated daily with the latest information. You will, if you follow these, you'll see and hear about interesting things that are going on, newsworthy or pop culture that you won't see or hear other places. They are interesting every day, but not in the mainstream media. So it takes alternative media sites like this to help bring it to light. I encourage you to take a look. Let's see, what else do I have? Let's go on. I mentioned back here, Stop AAPI Hate, the Asian American Culture. We have invited the co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate to come to campus in what, about 2 weeks. Today's Monday, so it'll be 2 weeks from today at the Spurlock Museum. We're having a panel discussion with Professor Jung. It will be about the impact on anti-Asian hate on mental health, families, and our communities. And I'll be moderating when we have a panel of experts that will help talk about mental health and community. They include a psychologist, Dr. Teresa Mock, a social work professor, Professor Kevin Tan, and the director of the New American Welcome Center, Gloria Yen. So it is a stellar group that I'll be able to speak with, moderate this panel with. I want to bring you a gift. If you'd like, you can have one of these buttons that Stop Asian Hate. Buttons. I have plenty. If you want to, go ahead and take two. And let me go back. How are we doing on time? 4:50. So we still have a little bit of time. Yes? Great. Let me stop here. I mentioned at the beginning some other topics that we haven't talked about yet. How many of you speak English as a second language, or not your first language? Many of you. Do any of you ever hear attitudes from students typically that might sound like, oh, I can't understand that foreign teaching assistant. Oh, that instructor has a heavy accent. Stay away from that person's class. Or I don't want to be a lab partner with so-and-so because I can't understand what they say. Maybe in science you don't hear it so much, but in lots of other parts of the university, those are pretty commonly heard. Are they things that you hear in engineering? Not so much. Some. They say it to your face? Wow.
Professor one.
Yeah,
Quite a bit.
you do hear it a bit, quite a bit.
Yeah, don't take this professor's class, or like try to get a different professor because they're not that interested.
And many of these people who speak English as a second or third language are quite fluent, right? Everybody has to take tests of spoken English and they pass it before they're allowed to go in front of a classroom, right? All students, U of I students, have to do well on the TOEFL, the written test of English. Everybody's very fluent at the university. There's no question. And yet There are these attitudes that it's hard for me to understand. I can't do well in this class as a student because that foreign instructor just is a bad teacher. It's their fault. Right? That's not a stretch to imagine that happening. Let me tell you about the research in communicate in the field of communications. There's been studies of perceptions of comprehension. So the study goes something like this. A random group of American students, so probably predominantly white American students, but a wide range of US American college students were asked to listen to an audio lecture, short, probably a 5-minute lecture on a topic. And they were given a picture of this white American professor giving the lecture. Listen to the 5 minutes and then take a simple quiz. The other group of students were told, you listen to this exact same lecture, and here is your professor teaching it. And it was an Asian face. They took the same comprehension exam. What do you think might have happened? They heard exactly the same voice, but they thought one was Asian and one was white. Comprehension indeed was affected. Those who thought they were listening to an Asian didn't do as well overall on those comprehension exams. So what does that mean? There is a perception bias. People are racist. People think that they're not going to understand, so they're probably not going to try as hard. And they're going to blame the instructor instead of blaming themselves for trying harder. Does that surprise you? Unfortunately, no. No. Has anything like this happened to any of you or someone you know? Let's talk about names. There are common American, US American names, and then there are names that might be described as foreign. I think you know what I mean. Do you think that affects employment? Do you think that affects people's attitudes and interactions? Yeah, of course it does. There's plenty of research in labor relations that suggests those with quote unquote foreign sounding names don't get as many job interviews and don't get as many job offers. That is definitely true. In graduate school, I had a friend who had one of those foreign sounding Asian names in engineering. Yeah, he's actually a civil engineering major. He sent out resumes to a ton of companies and got very few interviews and didn't get any job offers. And he did that for a full year and was so frustrated. Hold on a sec. The next year he decided he's going to do an experiment, and he threw on his resume. He changed his first name to an American sounding name. I think he used the name Nicholas, with the same last name. Everything else on the resume was exactly the same. He got a lot of interviews and he got several job offers. Nothing changed except for his first name. Again, it's perceptions matter a lot. I'm not telling you to change your name, but I am saying society's not fair. Yes, you had something? Ah, yes.
Is that racism or like considered as racism? Because in most of the jobs, people just require citizens, so they don't have to spend the money.
For those who don't understand, can you explain a little bit about what kind of money and why and how long it takes?
So for international students, we have to get sponsorship to exist on the job, because after F1 visa expires, we have to return to our country if we don't get the citizenship or PR request from the company. So most of the companies don't want to sponsor them because they require that needs money, like 5,000 or 10,000.
Right.
US dollars. So that's why they always try to get US citizen
people,
Mhm.
that they don't have to spend that extra money.
And the process can take months or years.
Yeah.
So some employers don't want to expend that money and time to support a best worker if the best worker is not a US, not eligible to work in the US with that special process. That is a deterrent. It is indeed. Yes.
So, I have a friend who is Canadian and, I don't know if this is true, but she said that that question is actually illegal, like they're not allowed to ask it on application. And she was getting frustrated because she was like applying and not getting anything. So her reasoning was that since that question was illegal, she would start saying no. Like that she didn't need sponsorship,
Mhm.
and then like bringing it up like after, like the interview. And like got interviews and stuff like that, but I don't know, like,
Yeah, that same thing happened. So if I say, yes, I need sponsorship, they don't even call for the interview. So if you say no, then they will call for the interview, and after getting the job, you can say, I need sponsorship. It's like, it's not all kind of fun. Yeah.
well, yeah. So I don't know. As I said, I don't know if it actually is illegal to like ask that question in the US. Yeah, that's what she was saying, that it's actually, that you're not allowed to ask that question, but people do.
I feel like it's a bit early for. It was illegal in Canada though?
No, this was in Michigan.
Oh, she was just from Canada.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, it raises a good question. I should study more about what are the laws specifically related to this. I will do that. I think there are some, and I probably shouldn't say anything without being more of an expert on it. I think there are some questions that can be asked in certain circumstances. Wording comes to mind. Are you legally authorized to work in the United States? I think that, or a version of that question, is allowed in certain circumstances, but not in all circumstances. But I don't know the details of when, so I will look that up. Let me move on to another question. Have any of you ever heard of this China initiative that existed during the Trump administration? No, none of you. The China initiative. And have any of you ever heard of Dr. Wen-Ho Lee? Wen-Ho Lee. He was in the news, maybe 20 years ago. You're nodding. What can you remember, if anything, about Wen-Ho Lee?
Wasn't he like a scientist that
Yes.
started like, he didn't like his science was a basis for then how we later treated COVID-19 or reacted to viruses? Is that correct?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
That may be David Ho, who was an AIDS researcher who laid some groundwork for this. Wen-Ho Lee was also a scientist at the Los Alamos lab in New Mexico, I think. New Mexico, a Chinese American immigrant, high-level scientist, and I forget what year, about 20 years ago, he was accused as being a spy for the Chinese government, accused by the US government. So he was arrested, imprisoned for years, finally got to trial, and he was found not so much. He really wasn't a spy. He was found guilty of a minor charge of something like improper storage of confidential information and given a slap on the wrist. Was he a spy for the Chinese government? No, but certainly the US government was sending a message to people of Chinese descent, then we're watching you and we may arrest you or anyone who may look like you if we feel like it. So that was a long time ago, 20 some years ago. Not so many years ago, during the Donald Trump administration, they brought that idea back and they called it the China Initiative. And the Homeland Security, through Donald Trump's people, were beginning to investigate scientists across the United States who were of Chinese descent. Most of them were university professors or university-based researchers. And a handful have been arrested. A few of them have been taken to trial. None of them have been found guilty of espionage for the Chinese government. So what's going on? Most experts would say the US government, under some leaders, are really looking to target people of Asian descent, in this case right now, people of Chinese descent, to be foreign spies. And it's pretty much been found unwarranted. It's just racist, xenophobic behavior. So when we're talking about anti-Asian racism in academia, in STEM, could it happen? It does happen. It happens all the time when you're looking for jobs, when you're teaching in your classes, when you're trying to publish your research. There may be government officials coming to want to confiscate your data to see who you're sharing your data with. Scary stuff. It could happen. Most of you in the room appear to be women. How do you see that as a disadvantage in the work that you do? Engineering is certainly a white male dominated field. How much do you see gender playing into this, or the intersection of gender and race? Anyone want to share?
I heard from one of my friends, so she's in the civil engineering. So she said she needs to be extra aggressive so that people could listen to her.
Extra aggressive. Yeah. In order to get heard by the others, or maybe to be able to take credit for one's own ideas so that somebody else doesn't steal the credit for those ideas, or be extra aggressive in speaking so that you're not talked over by the men in the group. No, all those are very common. Very, very common. Any other examples come to mind?
I worked in industry before coming back for my PhD, and I as a part of it did inspection on construction sites. And they're kind of notorious for just all kinds.
Construction sites are dominated by men.
Yeah.
And as a woman who's in charge to inspect, how do they treat you?
Oh, not great, not great. Yeah, you either like need to be, I mean, you kind of have to pick the persona that you're gonna go with beforehand. And sometimes that works out and sometimes that backfires, and you get called like sweetie or honey a lot. Your expertise gets diminished quite a bit.
Right.
Even when they don't really know what they're talking about. But that's not even just like a construction site thing, like it can be other engineers that like will make jokes about like, go make a sand, like while you're in the kitchen, why don't you make me a sandwich or stuff like that.
Bring me some coffee. Yeah, yeah. And imagine if you present as white, if you can imagine being a woman and a minority, and perhaps with an accent that doesn't seem like a Native American speaker. Ooh, those issues of discrimination are compounded
For sure.
on a construction site. Yeah, yeah. Is there anything that you have on your mind that you wish that we talked about that we haven't yet?
I think one thing when I talk with like my friends and even family about like, I guess, like Asian hate or just like being Asian American is people don't realize the nuances of like being different kinds of Asian and like kind of how that corresponds, or I've seen like Asian on Asian hate.
Okay.
And, like, I don't know if you have any thoughts on like approaching those conversations, because also like, I think there's also something to reckon, like people come from different privileges, not only just from the culture, but also like their socioeconomic levels, and it's like, just because I'm Indian American doesn't mean that my another person I know who's Indian American comes from the same background as me, or like, so I don't know, that's something that I'm always struggling to like explain to people, like, yes, we're like all Asian American and like we have shared experiences, but also we are very different from culturally, socioeconomically.
Very true, very true. I don't have any simple answers, no. Something that's been in the news more recently, the last couple of years, is Indian American caste issues. We think of caste as something from a long time ago over there in India, but here in the US, it doesn't. There's no effect. There's a fairly recent book written by an African-American, a Black American, about caste, and she is, what's her name? Something Williamson. Isabella Williamson? Isabella Williamson, called Caste, and it's about how African Americans have almost become an underclass, a permanent caste, a low caste in the US. That's not what I'm talking about. That's an interesting book. Read it. It's a good read. I'm talking about Indian Americans being discriminatory against other Indian Americans because of perceived caste from India. And it's become so prominent in the state of California. I think it's the California State University System, which is the largest university system in the US, has now put caste in as one of those protected classes, just like race and gender and sexual orientation and disability. Caste is now a protected class.
It was Isabel Wilkerson.
Wilkerson.
Yeah, it's past the origins of our disconnects.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So that's one way that Asian Americans can discriminate against one another. What others were you thinking of?
I mean, yeah, so like, so there's definitely like, within Indian American, yes, there's caste, there's also just like regional. People have opinions about different regions, but it's even something as like, so my family, most of them are in India, they have opinions about other Asian countries, and I've also heard other Asian Americans speak about other groups that they may not be part of in sort of a discriminatory way, and it's like, it's very frustrating because it's like, one, we're being discriminated by large population, and now we're discriminating within ourselves, and it's just, it's very frustrating because it's like, should we even unite, or should, should more be done to separate? I mean, there's the whole.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Between like East Asian and South Asian, and should we all even be considered one giant Asian American? Sorry, those are the thoughts of the day.
Those are a lot of thoughts, a lot of complicated thoughts. People's prejudices carry forward with them and are oftentimes passed down to the next generation, right? Locally here in Illinois, we see that coming from Chicago. A lot of the undergrad students who come from Chicago may bring their own prejudice against this neighborhood or against that ethnic group when they come to campus. They learned it up in Chicago, but immigrants or international visitors, scholars may do the same. It does happen a lot. What should we do about time? It is now about 5:10. Do you want me to go to this? Do you want?
Everyone is still on the survey, so the survey helped us to improve the workshop in the future. Also, it helped us to get continuously funded by the IDA.
As the first question on it, has you make a ID code for us to kind of identify you by? If you made one, if you were at a previous workshop, it's the same ID code, and this helps us track if you come to multiple workshops, because if you fill out the survey at multiple workshops, you get prizes like stickers in the future.
Ooh, stickers.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that's right.
You're most welcome. Thank you for inviting me to come and talk with you. And at the Asian American Cultural Center, we have lots of talks like this every week. Every Tuesday at noon, we have a lunchtime discussion series we call Food for Thought. Come, you're most welcome. The topic varies from week to week, but it's always about things like this, things of interest to Asian and Asian American communities. And we welcome everybody to come and serve you a free lunch
What day is that on?
every Tuesday at noon. Yep.
It's also gonna be-
Also, one last question. Well, we advocate for minority, but bringing unfairness as well. Like, I mean, I don't want to be a jerk, but it seems like if we overly promote like some minorities and then it bring in unfairness in other groups.
Can you describe more of what you mean?
Yes. So like the recent lawsuits like against the college admission of Howard or MIT that they're saying, so there's some like documentation include the minority like diversity. But actually because of that and then you like HR has to be at school grade.
Yeah. Right. So I think what you're talking about is the current Supreme Court case about affirmative action. The court began hearing the case yesterday, so it is very much in the news this week. The final verdict is expected this summer. It should be midsummer when the decision is made and released to the public. All the experts expect the same thing. They expect that this very conservative Supreme Court is going to overturn affirmative action. It will no longer be legal in the United States. Just as what was the other big case from a few months ago? Abortion. Abortion is no longer protected in the United States. It can be protected by states, but the Supreme Court overturned Roe versus Wade. They are about to overturn affirmative action too. So let me give you my interpretation of what this means. Affirmative action, as you probably all know, helps people, decision makers, admissions officers or hiring agents for companies to affirmatively hire someone if they're from an underrepresented group. As long as the applicants are fairly equal, we can give preference to women in engineering or African Americans at Harvard, right? That's affirmative action in a very basic manner. So this case that's in front of the Supreme Court has been working its way up for several years. It's being backed by a white American, very ultra-conservative lawyer named Edward Bloom, and he has been putting forward these cases for 10, 15 years as test cases, and he's finally successful. He's got this one to the Supreme Court. Some of you may have remember there was a case, what year was it? 2015, give or take, Abigail Fisher versus University of Texas. That was a affirmative action test case. He lost. He's persistent. He's tried again, and this one he is likely going to win. So in this case, he is saying Harvard University discriminates unfairly against Asian American students. He's white, remember, and he's taking this case on behalf of Asian Americans. He's saying there are thousands of Asian American high school seniors who have perfect SAT scores, perfect GPAs, and they are being rejected by Harvard in favor of less qualified students who are minorities, Black, Latino. So the case is the question of who's qualified and who's most qualified, and does Harvard get to decide who they want to be part of their freshman class, right? That's essentially what they're saying. So this conservative lawyer, Edward Bloom, is pitting Asian Americans against African Americans as a racial wedge to say, hey, Asian Americans are actually better than the Black Americans. You should be taking more Asian Americans. And he's pushing this to the Supreme Court so that the Supreme Court will say, yeah, affirmative action isn't right. It should be illegal. This guy doesn't really want to help support Asian Americans. That's just his gimmick. He's trying to dismantle affirmative action that has helped African Americans and Latinos and women, white women, for decades. That's the motivation behind it.
I just wanted to make a comment just to add to what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's interesting because that tactic was also successful in California before. So California currently doesn't have affirmative action. But if you look at like their university, like their state university admissions, it requires a diversity statement. Some of them even take those like graphic information into consideration. When you're doing your application, they'll ask your sexuality, even, which is, you know, a step beyond most institutions do. And then even, I know like obviously Harvard isn't Boston, but there was a case in Boston that was also successfully argued that Asian families, they have, I don't think it's like a regional or lottery system necessarily, but it's kind of like similar to here where you apply for the school that you go to. And there was Asian Bostonians that weren't being able to get into the high schools that they wanted to because they were all trying to make the demographics of all the schools completely equal for like what the actual population represented.
Yeah.
And that case was won by the residents there. So it is interesting that it is like a trend. And I know like the Abigail Fisher case just got like thrown out because she just didn't have good scores or anything. There was no reason. Especially because white women are the best, not the best, the most successful with affirmative action.
Yeah.
To get it,
Good,
you know,
good.
more than anyone else. But
Mhm.
it is a trend.
Yep,
And like
it is.
originally it was made to only last 40 years, so it is past 40 years, but the argument is it's still needed, you know, it hasn't really balanced out, but.
Yeah, you described it very, very well. The term higher education experts use is that's holistic review. We're not just looking at GPA and SAT scores, but we're looking at the whole person, including what their background is, what are the challenges that they may have overcome to get to where they are. Holistic review will probably still be allowed. But quotas were eliminated in the 1970s. The rest of affirmative action will likely be eliminated this summer. Who here has heard the term model minority? Asian Americans are a model minority. Almost all of you. So model minority is a misunderstood term. I'd like to explain to you a little bit about it and how it relates to this Harvard affirmative action case. It's really exactly the same. The dynamics are exactly the same. The term affirmative action typically means Asian American, no. The model minority myth usually refers to Asian Americans are really smart and they do well in school and in the workplace. They don't complain. They don't have a lot of struggles. They're good at math. And they become really good citizens in this country, right? Do you agree? That's kind of what it means. Where does it come from? It comes from 1966, a New York Times Magazine article written by a sociologist who was describing Japanese Americans' success. Remember, in World War II, I mentioned this, during World War II, Japanese Americans were imprisoned because they were Japanese and Japan was the enemy. After Japanese Americans were released from those concentration camps in the US, they worked hard. They tried to assimilate as much as they could in the US. They tried to not be overtly Japanese because that got them thrown into jails. And Japanese Americans started doing quite well academically and economically in the US. So the sociologist in 1966 wrote an article to say, look at the success story of Japanese Americans. They were imprisoned 20 years ago and now they are model citizens of this nation. They're doing so well academically and economically. They're model minorities. And soon that term was used, expanded to include Chinese Americans, Indian Americans, all kinds of Asian Americans. Great, right? No, it wasn't great. What else was happening in the 1960s, 1966? What was happening during that time? Vietnam War, what else? Civil rights movement. Civil rights movement led by what group? Black Americans. This article wasn't really trying to say Japanese Americans were great. They were really saying some minorities can do it well and they don't complain. You can see Japanese Americans were imprisoned, and yet now one generation later, they're doing so well. They've got nothing to complain about. If you're a minority and you're not doing well, must be you're doing something wrong. It's either your culture is wrong or it's your own fault for not trying hard enough. That was the real intent of this model minority idea. So today, most people don't understand the second level. The surface level is Asian Americans do well. The real meaning behind it, the real intent behind it was African Americans are doing poorly in this country because it's their own fault. It's not because of a lack of government intervention, not because of racism, societal racism. It's Black people's own fault. So let's fast forward to today, 2022, and affirmative action. This Edward Bloom lawyer is saying, Asian Americans deserve to be in Harvard more. Those of you who may have gotten a 3.9 GPA and a 1550, you're not as good as those 8,000 Asian Americans who got the 4.0s and 1600s. It's your own fault for not doing as well. It's really the same concept. It is trying to falsely promote Asian Americans at the expense of African Americans. That's what this case is today.
I forget which book it was because I read both of her books back to back, but it's Dr. Beverly Tatum.
Yeah.
And one of them is Can We Talk About Race? And the other one is Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together at Lunch?
Yeah.
And one of them goes into exactly what you were talking about what happened when they were talking about model citizens and then how, you know, Italians all of a sudden became white, history.
Yep.
And then she also goes into like examples of like how to be a good like hiring manager and like kind of what you're saying earlier, like holistic approach. And like you meet the minimum requirements. That doesn't mean you have to grab someone who's like the top person, right? Like if someone crosses the threshold, then all those people are eligible for the job. Or well, she was talking about jobs, but you can talk about anything there. And like she gave like examples of that, and I thought that was cool. Is that one? Okay. I read them both back to back, and they're both she's the same author. I was like, oh
Yes.
Well,
Thank
you so
you.
much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Like last time, the back for pizza, they'll be back on. Pizza. And the next, summer.
Would be.
Okay. Next week, yeah.
Yes. It's on the webinar next. It's about LGBTQ students and judges.
Yeah, so next Wednesday is November 9th. So next Wednesday on LGBTQ planning. Yeah. So, you can always sign up. Thanks, awesome for today. And thank you all for keep coming to get teachers.